There is a massive fraud that has been perpetrated on the American people. A fraud that is robbing us of our wealth, condemning our children and future generations to tyranny of forever debt, and making a mockery of the principles for which so many Americans gave their lives in armed battles with tyrants. This fraud is called the Federal Reserve banking and income tax system. The Federal Reserve has greater immediate power to influence the standard of living of individual Americans than the Congress or the President of the United States. And this private corporation operates outside the checks and balances of government that was established by the Constitution. I'm Kevin Perteete, and I'm going to narrate America's destruction, the 100th anniversary of the Federal Reserve Act. And I want you to understand that this is over 1,000 years of banking history. I'm going to give you a very condensed version of American history. I'm going to pick it up at the founding of America and our forefathers. Another thing that I found in my research that I feel many people do not know or were never taught is that our founding fathers did not come here to establish freedom for all. They came to America to establish their freedom and a new world order through the Masonic fraternity. 23 of the 39 signers of the Constitution were Freemasons. But they did leave the doors open for future generations to see if we truly could govern ourselves and not rely on government to protect and take care of us. And I must say that I think that we have not done a very good job at it. So, I'm going to walk you through with the beginning of America and our forefathers. The first settlers, or the Pilgrims, began coming to America after the 1500s, and life was very difficult for them in the beginning. They initially instituted a system of common ownership, or communism. As a result, over half of them died of starvation and disease. Quickly learning their lesson, every man was given his own piece of land on which to grow his own food and build his own home. With little money available, the primary means of exchange was the barter system. Gradually, some foreign coinage came into the colony and facilitated trade. However, as the economy of Massachusetts grew quickly due to its hard-working new Americans, people, natural resources, and free enterprise, the need for a medium of exchange became very important. Knowing about England's tally system, Massachusetts issued debt-free paper scrip into circulation in 1690. Despite problems that developed with this invention due to there being no standard of value, the economy flourished with full employment. Other colonies adopted this system in varying degrees and prospered also. During this period, there was no official banking system. A few loaning offices were maintained by the colonies, but less than 30 private lending institutions existed in all the 13 colonies. Today, how many do you think there are? Almost too many to count. Now let's skip ahead 73 years. In 1763, Benjamin Franklin was in England. He was asked to explain why the colonies were so prosperous while England was suffering. He replied, "That is simple. It is only because in the colonies we issue our own money. It is called colonial scrip, and we issue it in the proper proportion to the demands of trade and industry." The Bank of England soon learned of this situation and forced Parliament to pass a bill prohibiting the colonies from issuing their own money. Franklin said within 1 year from that date, the streets of the colonies were filled with the unemployed. Later, Franklin said that this was the original cause of the War of Independence. In his own words, the colonies would gladly have borne the little tax on tea and other matters had it not been that England took away from the colonies their money, which created unemployment and dissatisfaction. Understand that the founding of America began in the dispute over who would control the issue of money and taxation. The forefathers rebelled against unlawful taxation imposed upon them, and they risked imprisonment and death to free us from the yoke of European bankers, and in the end they won our freedom temporarily. Now remember, I told you that the forefathers came here to establish their new world order and to experiment to see if man could truly rule and govern himself. Now, these guys were not noble and honorable in a lot of ways, and they did a lot of criminal things, and that's why they wanted to have the power in their new group so they could do what they wanted to do, and that's how it works with these families that are fighting for power and control in the world and the different groups, because they want to control certain aspects of different things. Now, as I said, they left the door open for us to fend for ourselves. Alexander Hamilton, a friend of the international banking community, sponsored legislation to create a central bank. He argued that although privately owned and not authorized by the Constitution, the bank would work in partnership with government to facilitate control of the economy. Thomas Jefferson argued that central control of the money supply would lead to a dictatorship by those few with their hands on that supply, and their greed would eventually plunge this country into perpetual debt. What a visionary, because that's exactly what has happened to us. Jefferson lost and Hamilton won. And Alexander Hamilton is revered as a great American patriot, and many people feel that he is a much bigger traitor than Benedict Arnold was. So, a Bank of the United States was established for a 20-year charter in 1791 through 1811. The War of 1812 between America and Great Britain was an attempt for the Bank of England to establish rule over us again, as was the case before our War of Independence. After the War of 1812, the country was in economic chaos, so it was another opportunity for easy profits, and the bankers influenced Congress to a second central bank of the U.S., all under the presidency of James Madison, who had earlier vetoed a bill to renew the franchise of the bank. But he succumbed to the pressures, and because of the economic condition of America, he gave in to the bankers. A second central bank was started and granted a 20-year charter from 1816 to 1836. But in 1829, a man by the name of Andrew Jackson became the 7th president of the United States and vowed to get rid of the bankers. He declared war on them. He said to them in scolding words, "You are a den of vipers and thieves, and I intend to rout you out. And by the eternal God, I will rout you out." He vetoed renewing the bank's charter, and in his message to Congress said this: "The bold effects that the present bank has made to control the government, the distress it has wantonly caused, are but premonitions of the fate which awaits the American people should they be deluded into a perpetuation of this institution or the establishment of another like it. If the people only understood the rank injustice of our money and banking system, there would be a revolution before morning." Jackson removed U.S. funds from the second bank of the U.S. and placed them in state banks. He also eliminated the national debt, and is the only president in American history to have this distinction. There was an assassination attempt made on his life on January 30th, 1835 by Richard Lawrence, but both his pistols misfired, and he was captured and later tried and found innocent by reason of insanity, and later bragged about his contact with the European bankers who had promised to protect him if he were caught. Next was a plot for a civil war. So a plot was hatched to conquer by dividing the U.S. into two nations. The bankers decided to instigate a war between the North and the South over the slavery issue. The London branch of the Rothschilds financed the North in part through their agent August Belmont Schoenberg, and the Paris branch financed the South through their agents Judah P. Benjamin and John Slidell. However, the bankers, thinking that they had Lincoln at their mercy, overstepped themselves. When the Union requested loans from the private banks to conduct the war, the bankers demanded 28% interest. This angered Lincoln, and he proceeded to have Congress authorize in 3 issues a total of $450 million worth of U.S. notes called Lincoln Greenbacks, which were paid directly for goods and services required for the war. These issues of debt-free money not only saved the Union, but would have destroyed the power of the bankers. The London Times, a banker's paper, editorialized said this: "If this mischievous financial policy, which has its origin in the North American Republic, shall become indurated down to a fixture, then that government will furnish its own money without cost, it will pay off its debts and be without debt. It will have all the money necessary to carry on its commerce. It will become prosperous without precedent in the history of the world. The brains and the wealth of all countries will go to North America. That government must be destroyed, or it will destroy every monarchy on the globe." And Lincoln said this of the bankers: "The money power preys upon the nation in times of peace and conspire against it in times of adversity. It is more despotic than monarchy, more insolent than autocracy, more selfish than bureaucracy. It denounces as public enemies all who question its methods or throw light upon its crimes. I have two great enemies, the Southern Army in front of me and the financial institutions in the rear. Of the two, the one in my rear is my greatest foe." Eventually, the bankers were able to get a law through Congress declaring these greenbacks not to be legal tender for the payment of import or export duties, nor for the payment of taxes, nor for the payment of the interest on the national debt. This resulted in the greenbacks losing their value and dropping to about 30 cents on the dollar. The bankers then were able to buy these greenbacks at 30 cents on the market and use them at par value to buy government bonds worth several $billions. The Congress was then induced to pass the National Banking Act of 1863, which allowed the banks to issue their own currency up to 90% of the amount of the United States bonds that they had in their vaults. Most of these were purchased at 30 cents on the dollar, so they made their 28% all right, and a lot more. The tendency of the banks to exploit our country in time of war is one of the cruel facts of history. In order to protect their money monopoly and prevent the expansion of the honest debt-free money system instituted by Lincoln, he had to be eliminated, and he was. John Wilkes Booth was a member of the Knights of the Golden Circle, a secret society which was controlled by the bankers, as are virtually all secret societies today. They can be identified by the promotion of the bankers' deceptive religious philosophy, the brotherhood of man under the fatherhood of God. Now, I was always taught in school that John Wilkes Booth was trapped and then they lit the barn on fire and burned and killed him. But I saw a documentary years later that clearly showed that a man of his exact description did not die in that fire and that he escaped. And he also, like Richard Lawrence, bragged and boasted that the bankers would take care of him if he assassinated Lincoln. And Bismarck, Chancellor of Germany, made the following statement regarding the death of Lincoln. "The death of Lincoln was a disaster for Christendom. There was no man in the United States great enough to wear his boots, and the bankers went anew to grab the riches of the world. I fear that foreign bankers, with their craftiness and torturous tricks, will entirely control the exuberant riches of America and use it to systematically corrupt modern civilization. They will not hesitate to plunge the whole of Christendom into wars and chaos in order that the earth should become their inheritance." He was right on the mark, because that's exactly what has happened. I want to know, are you now beginning to see the pattern of American history? In 1873, the government went from the silver to the gold standard. The official unit of currency became a gold coin containing 25.8 grains of standard gold. We operated under that gold standard from 1873 to 1933, and these were years, for the most part, of great prosperity. Nevertheless, the policies of the banks did cause a number of very, very severe panics, especially in 1873, 1893, and 1907. But that was because the bankers simply closed their doors and shut down the credit. During these depressions, there was a tremendous amount of unemployment and a great many people suffered very seriously. However, as a whole, the country was prosperous. Prices kept dropping at a rate of about 1% per year between 1873 and 1900. Industry flourished, and the development of the West proceeded at a tremendous pace. By 1900, most of the national debt had been paid off. And the result was that the bankers did not have enough government bonds to use as a basis for the issuance of their own currency. So they became desperately anxious to establish in the United States a monetary system very similar to the privately owned Bank of England and similar banks that existed in most of the European countries. But that was not an easy thing to accomplish, because by this time the people of the nation had become very suspicious of the operations of Wall Street, and they were very hostile to the machinations of the money manipulators. Nevertheless, they were finally able to succeed in getting this kind of a banking system established, but only after a series of deceitful maneuvers that are without parallel in the history of the American nation. Here is what happened to eventually bring the Federal Reserve into existence. Paul Moritz Warburg one of the original architects of the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, said this: "We will have a world government whether you like it or not. The only question is whether that government will be achieved by conquest or consent." Mr. Warburg came to America from Germany in 1902. He was a member of the great Warburg family of financiers who were closely allied with the Rothschilds, who operated banks in France and in England. For those of you who don't know, the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers are two of the main conspirators throughout American history that have been trying to keep us in wars, in debt, and control our money supply. The Rothschilds being more prominent, and I want to say that because they've been around longer and they have much more wealth. It is said, I don't know if it's true or not, but the Rothschilds own half the world's money supply. Now, I don't know, but that's what I hear. Nevertheless, they are very, very powerful and very, very wealthy beyond imagination. And they are part of the secret societies and part of the mystery religion of Babylon. Now, all of this is a whole nother story to get into. That's not my intent or purpose at this moment. It's just to share a little bit of knowledge with you. And their goal has always been to rule and to control the world. And it started mainly through Mayer Amschel Rothschild, who made this statement: "Give me control of a nation's money, and I care not who makes her laws." Mayer Amschel Rothschild, 1744 through 1812. Then his son, Nathan Rothschild, made a similar statement, and he said, "I care not what puppet is placed upon the throne of England to rule the empire on which the sun never sets. The man who controls Britain's money supply controls the British Empire, and I control the British money supply." Nathan Rothschild, 1777 through 1836. Then David Rockefeller said this at a congressional committee when he testified: "You know, gentlemen, that I do not owe any personal income tax, but nevertheless I send a small check now and then to the Internal Revenue Service out of the kindness of my heart." It was later disclosed that it was Rothschild money which financed Mr. Warburg when he came to the United States. For $500,000, he bought a partnership in N.W.O and Company, a great financial concern in New York City. Then he was given a salary of $500,000 a year, which was a lot of money in those days, especially when there was no income tax. And what was his job? His job was to go up and down the United States promoting the idea of a great central bank that would solve all the economic problems of the United States forever. He promised that if Congress would pass a bill setting up the kind of bank that Mr. Warburg was promoting, there would never again be any such thing as a depression. There would never again be any such thing as inflation or deflation. There would always be enough money to carry on business, and credit would be available for all necessary and desirable purposes throughout the United States. Mr. Warburg was a very persuasive man, and he developed a good many friends who liked his ideals, especially many of the leading bankers on Wall Street, but he also developed a great many enemies who did not believe all of his promises. The banking plan, which eventually became the Federal Reserve System, was put together by a group of financiers who assembled on Jekyll Island just off the coast of Georgia in the fall of 1910. These bankers met there in the greatest of secrecy. Warburg was one of them. Senator Nelson Aldrich of Rhode Island was another. There were also representatives from all the great banking concerns in New York City. This group gradually hammered out the kind of bill that they wanted. Senator Aldrich then introduced his bill into Congress. However, he wasn't clever enough to make it look like a government institution. Warburg had told them that if they wanted to get this bill passed, that they would have to make the American people believe that the new banking system would be a government institution independent of Wall Street. Otherwise, it would never get passed into law. This turned out to be true. The Aldrich bill was rejected. The bankers had to find someone who would convince the American people that the new banking system would operate under the control of the government and not Wall Street. They needed a special kind of political leader to do this. So the bankers found their man. His name was Woodrow Wilson. He was one of the most persuasive and, as it turned out, probably one of the most hypocritical politicians on the national scene. What history has established is the fact that Woodrow Wilson went up and down the United States attacking the Wall Street bankers right at the time that they were paying for his campaign. He accused the bankers of every crime in the world. He said he was opposed to them and that it would be his objective in office to prevent them from ever getting any of their kind of legislation passed. It was all part of the political strategy and game to make Woodrow Wilson president. His backers encouraged him to tell the people what they wanted to hear. Of course, at that time, the Republican Party was the majority party in the United States. So the bankers realized that they had to do something to reduce the amount of votes that would go to the Republican candidate, William Howard Taft. Therefore, they induced Teddy Roosevelt, who was also a Republican, to organize a Bull Moose Party in 1912. So Teddy Roosevelt had organized the Bull Moose Party in order to bring about a conservative government for the United States. But what he had really done was to split the Republican vote so that Woodrow Wilson would be able to get elected by 42% of the popular vote in 1912. Once Woodrow Wilson got into office, he had to operate very carefully, pretending that he was opposed to anything that was wanted by the bankers, but all the time working with them. Congressman Carter Glass introduced the Federal Reserve Act, but he later wrote that the mastermind of the whole performance was Woodrow Wilson. Eventually, the Federal Reserve Act was passed on December 23, 1913, when most of Congress were away on Christmas vacation. They got a man by the name of Henry Parker Willis, who was a professor at the University of Chicago, to prepare a text of the proposed law. It went through 4 or 5 revisions, and when then shown to William Jennings Bryan, he named 4 changes that would be necessary. When President Wilson saw the proposed changes, he accepted them because they were all non-substantial. President Wilson told Congressman Glass these changes would help make the people think that the Federal Reserve was indeed a governmental institution, whereas it actually remained as much a private organization as it was before. So this is the way the Federal Reserve Act was finally passed. Since 1913, we have had the stock market crash of 1929, the Great Depression, and about 14 recessions. Other than the Great Depression, the most notable of those being the 1973-74 recession, 1981-82, and of course, who can forget, the most recent and current one that we're in, the 2008 banking and mortgage meltdown, in which I was personally affected. The national debt went from $1 billion in 1913 to more than $12 trillion today. And oh yeah, don't forget, this doesn't even include all of the wars and conflicts that we've been a part of, in which the bankers have profited very heavily from. Regrets? Well, this is what President Wilson had to say after he signed the Federal Reserve Act. I am a most unhappy man. I have unwittingly ruined my country. A great industrial nation is now controlled by its system of credit. We are no longer a government by free opinion, no longer a government by conviction and the vote of majority, but a government by the opinion and duress of a small group of dominant men. Representative Charles Lindbergh Sr., father of famous aviator Carl Lindbergh Jr., had to say this about the Federal Reserve. This Federal Reserve Act establishes the most gigantic trust on earth. When the President signs this bill, the invisible government of the monetary power will be legalized. The worst legislative crime of the ages is perpetrated by this banking and currency bill. From now on, depressions will be scientifically created. Then you have Representative Lewis McFadden, who said this: "It was a carefully contrived occurrence. International bankers sought to bring about a condition of despair so that they might emerge the rulers of us all." And then he suspiciously died of intestinal flu after eating at a banquet. Then you have Henry Ford, creator of the automobile assembly line, and he had this to say: "It is well that the people of the nation do not understand our banking and monetary system, for if they did, I believe there would be a revolution before tomorrow morning." Then you have John F. Kennedy, the last president to even talk about doing something against the Federal Reserve, said this: "I tried to issue interest-free money into the system so the American people won't be enslaved by the banking cartel." Now, many feel that he was assassinated by the Federal Reserve, and in actuality it was the secret societies who teamed up and had him killed. And they're still a part of the Federal Reserve. They're all the one and the same. Because JFK was attacking the secret societies at their very heart and soul and was doing exactly what they did not want him to do. And that was uniting black people, white people, Hispanic people, etc. And he was about to sign legislations into law of that effect. So he had to be killed, and he was. Bill Cooper talks about this in his documentary entitled Kennedy, the Sacrifice King. I highly recommend you watch it if you can find the video anywhere. Then you have Congressman Ron Paul, who frequently speaks out on the Federal Reserve, said this: the next step is the merger of the Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, and the Bank of Japan into a one world central bank. The European Central Bank, ECB, will be modeled after the Federal Reserve. Like the Fed in 1913, it will have the institutional appearance of decentralization, but also like the Fed, it will be run by a cartel of big bankers in collusion with politicians at the expense of the public. And then Congressman Ron Paul says this: the Federal Reserve is the chief corporate behind the economic crisis. The other major event that occurred in 1913 was the addition of the 16th Amendment, which states, the Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes on income from whatever source derived, without apportionment among the several states, and without regard to any census or enumeration. Secretary of State Philander C. Knox stated that he verified that all the states properly ratified the 16th Amendment. But in the 1980s, two American patriots by the name of Bill Benson and Red Beckman went around to all the states and checked all the signatures for a 2-year period and found that the 16th Amendment was never properly ratified. And since then, Bill Benson has been fighting in court on cases regarding the 16th Amendment, and he's lost every single one of them, as with anyone who brings up the argument that the 16th Amendment was never properly ratified have lost their case also, simply because the government knows that it can never admit to the American people that the 16th Amendment was never properly ratified and that the whole income tax system is a fraud. Now, even if the 16th Amendment was properly ratified, it would still have absolutely nothing to do with your labor or wages. And I'm going to try to explain that to you in detail in just a moment. Now, in 1938, President Roosevelt called a secret meeting at the White House and had all the top U.S. attorneys, district attorneys, judges come, and he told them this: America is now a bankrupt nation, and that we must operate under a different type of law, and that you are to take silent judicial notice of this fact. Secrecy. And that's why the sovereign movement have not won lots of cases regarding the tax issue and so forth, because they know they can't let the cat out the bag. But, however, things are beginning to change, and people are winning cases, or starting to, and I attribute that to a process called the precession of the equinox. And without getting into really any deep science here, I'm going to try to explain it like this. As the Earth moves away from the center of the galaxy in a 26,000-year cycle, we fall asleep consciously. But what is starting to happen is that the Earth is starting to come back around, and we are waking up with the pole shifts and so forth, and we are waking up consciously. And the Illuminati know these cycles and sciences, and they know that their time of enslavement is very short. So in other words, the light is becoming more powerful than the dark. And I want to give a shout out to people like the late Aaron Russo, who talks about the income tax in his documentary America, Freedom, and Fascism. And to all the people out there who have made documentary films and had seminars and meetings on these types of subjects, to try to free America and the world and inform us on what's going on. Also, to Peter Joseph, the writer and director of the movie Zeitgeist, I want to thank personally, because I think your work was very well done, and I highly recommend all of you to watch those two documentaries. They are very educational and informative. Another area that the government are definitely afraid of you finding out is that there are two classes of citizenship in America. There's a sovereign state citizen, and then there's a 14th Amendment federal U.S. citizen. There are many people who argue that the whole sovereign movement is incorrect because you are both state and federal citizens at the same time, and that the 14th Amendment did not change anything. Well, I highly disagree with that, and I'm going to try to show and prove that to you in just a moment. Another thing you should know is that when the government spells your name in all uppercase caps versus lowercase, that means a totally different thing, and it has total different legal meanings and implications in law. And the whole issue of taxes, sovereignty or state citizenship, and Social Security numbers can be made into 3 different movies entirely. And I simply need to show you how they tie in with the Federal Reserve. So I'm going to try to do that quickly. Now, this whole issue of citizenship was not even an issue until 1868 when they added the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. Now, here's my question. Why did they wait nearly 100 years after the signing of the Constitution to add this? Now, wouldn't the case or the argument of citizenship have been a very important thing to have defined or explained back in 1787 or shortly thereafter? I think so. And what were these people and the president and citizens before 1868? There was no such thing as a U.S. citizen then. They created it in 1868. So I want to show you how the 14th Amendment and the whole Social Security connection was used to enslave all of us as Americans to the New World Order. Now, this is how all this ties together. In 1913, of course, was the Federal Reserve Act. And then in 1924, there was a big case called Cook versus Tate, which stated that citizens of the United States, wherever they are resident, are subject to the income tax, which is based upon citizenship of the United States. Now, the government could not tax only the citizens of the United States under the so-called 14th Amendment and not tax white state citizens. And yes, at that time, it was only white people who were considered sovereign state citizens. But since then, all of those wordings have been amended and changed to include anyone born in the United States of America. If they did that, there would have been a revolution here in America. So the Federal Reserve banks deliberately caused the crash of the stock market of 1929, which is a matter of congressional record, and made all the people who had saved for their old age lose their money that they were saving. Then the government in 1935 instituted Social Security, and this was controlled and handled by each state on a state level, so the state could handle their own citizens and residents under the so-called 14th Amendment. Then in 1939, the U.S. government repealed the Social Security Act, which is a little known fact, and reenacted it into the 1939 Income Tax Code with a new intent and meaning, classifying everyone who has a Social Security number a taxpayer and a federal citizen of the United States under the so-called 14th Amendment. Now, the U.S. government, knowing this, under prompting of the Federal Reserve, stated that the people of America were saving too much money, congressional record, and therefore should pay an excise tax, congressional record. This was the victory tax to help out with World War II. But in 1 year, the government made so much money on this tax, they decided to repeal the 2-year limitation on this victory tax, and telling no one, they made it a permanent tax on the citizens of the United States who have a Social Security number. The 16th Amendment has been misinterpreted deliberately. Deceptive statements by IRS spokesmen and other propagandists have created great confusion as to whether these limitations on direct taxes are still in effect. Some incorrectly claim that the 16th Amendment changed the constitutional limitation on direct taxes and authorized an income tax as a direct tax without apportionment. The U.S. Supreme Court rejected these claims in the case of Brushaber v. Union Pacific Railroad Company, 240 U.S. 1, 1916, when they ruled that the 16th Amendment created no new power of taxation and that it did not change the constitutional limitation which forbid any direct taxation of individuals. The court stated that the nature of income tax is identified by the wording of the amendment itself. The court explained that since it is a tax without apportionment, the income tax cannot be a direct tax, a tax on individuals or on property, because the Constitution still requires that all direct taxes must be apportioned. If the income tax is not a direct tax, what kind of tax is it? The Brushaber decision, which has never been overruled, cleared up the misunderstanding by stating, taxation on income was in its nature an excise, and it further stated that taxes on such income has been sustained as excises in the past. The ruling established that income tax is constitutional as an excise tax, but not as a direct tax. According to the court, the income tax is still an excise tax. The IRS relies on the Brushaber decision to prove the constitutionality of the income tax, but ignores the court's ruling that income tax is an excise tax. So, who or what then is subject to an excise tax? The U.S. Supreme Court in Flint v. Stone Tracy Company 220 U.S. 107 defined excises as taxes laid upon the manufacture, sale, or consumption of commodities within the country, upon licenses to pursue certain occupations, and upon corporate privileges. Individuals are not commodities or corporations, so the only way an individual could be even indirectly subject to an excise tax is if he or she were granted a license to engage in an occupation of special privilege, such as a manufacture of alcohol, tobacco, firearms, or oil. The court has ruled that such manufacturers are granted a license of special privilege by government, and that money earned in the exercise of that privilege is subject to an income excise tax. All occupations that one could lawfully pursue without the existence of government are occupations of common right and should not be subject to an income excise tax. For example, laborers, factory workers, salesmen, plumbers, electricians, computer technicians, doctors, merchants, nurses, secretary, truck drivers, waitresses, taxi drivers, waiters, DJs, etc. Now, the other thing that people always say to me is, look at Al Capone, how powerful of a gangster he was, and they brought him down on tax evasion. Right, and they were correct too, because Al Capone did not pay his alcohol tax. Remember I told you that you have to have a license of special granting by the government in order to sell alcohol. And Al Capone didn't do that. So he was convicted on federal charges of tax evasion in 1931. And it still doesn't matter, because Al Capone was distributing, manufacturing, and selling alcoholic beverages during the time of Prohibition, and that was illegal, so he still would have been brought up on federal charges. And then I have people say, well, what about Wesley Snipes and Willie Nelson and Irwin Ship and all these guys? Well, I can't tell you the exact reasons why they lost their cases, but I will tell you this. There is a procedure. You have to notify the government first before you just stop paying the tax. There's legal work you have to do beforehand. And if you don't do that, you're just putting yourself at a higher risk of them coming after you. In the same year, the government added the Revenue Act of 1913, which reimposed the federal income tax following the so-called ratification of the 16th Amendment. So, what is income? Income is a gain or profit made from your wages or compensation of labor, or from a government-granted privilege. Now remember I told you that the government-granted privilege was a special license to sell tobacco, oil, firearms, etc. In the Wikipedia, it gives a legal history of income tax in the United States. You can punch that in. And I just want you to see this one part. And I apologize for the blur if you're on full screen. It's the best that I could do. But the concept of income is never really defined in the Internal Revenue Code. Section 22A. Gross income includes gains, profits, and income derived from salaries, wages, or compensation for personal service. So what does that mean? You go to work, you make $1,000 a week. You take $1 and you go and win $50 million in the lotto, $189 million in the lotto, $25 million in the lotto. Doesn't matter. That is considered a gain, profit, or income. Now, keeping things simple, because there is still argument about that being income, but I want to keep things on a level that you can understand. That's considered a profit or gain because you didn't do any work or labor to make that. Or you take money and you invest it in the stock market. Take 10 grand and you make $100,000. That's considered a profit or income or a gain. Or in real estate, you buy a house for $100,000, it appreciates, and you make $200,000 on it. That's considered income. Another area of omitted history that I have to talk about quickly is that of the gold confiscation. When Franklin Roosevelt went into office in 1933, he followed the desires of the bankers because he was one of their main agents and controlled by them, just as Woodrow Wilson had been 20 years earlier. The first thing Roosevelt did when he got into office was he closed all the banks and called it a bank holiday. Then he issued an executive order telling the American people to turn in their gold on or before May 1st, 1933. Then he got the Gold Reserve Act passed in 1934, under which the United States government gave the Federal Reserve System all the gold that was in Fort Knox. They gave it to them as an outright gift. They didn't even ask for a receipt in return for the gold. Americans who owned gold were told under penalty of felony that they had to turn in all their gold coins to the United States government or to the Federal Reserve System. Now, I tried to research and find out if anyone was actually fined the $10,000 or imprisoned for 10 years for not turning in their gold. I found one minor case in which the gentleman won, so no one was actually fined or imprisoned, which is a good thing. All they received in return for their gold were Federal Reserve notes at around $20 for every ounce of gold they turned in. Then President Roosevelt got an act passed by Congress raising the price of gold bullion to $35 an ounce. So here people turned in their gold, got $20, and then President Roosevelt gets an act passed where it goes up to $35 an ounce for gold. So people missed out on that $15 an ounce. Plus, the dollar became worth less because when gold goes up, the value of the dollar goes down. However, Americans were smart enough not to turn in all their gold coins at $20 an ounce, but melted them into bullion and got $35 an ounce for them. Or they just kept their gold and shipped them out of country, or kept them within their families and kept their mouths shut. It wasn't until 40 years later, by another executive order by President Gerald Ford, that allowed Americans to own gold in private again. My question is this: to the 2013 generation, when the government asks you to turn in your guns, will you do it? It took just 20 short years to bankrupt America, from 1913 to 1933, when they took away the gold backing standard. I have a letter from the Department of Treasury, Bureau of Engraving and Printing, Washington, D.C., dated January 22, 1975, and I deleted the person's name for privacy reasons. And I apologize to you that it's blurry on the big screen. I did the best that I could, and I felt it was important for you to hear what it says. The underlying part says this: this Bureau engraves and prints all United States paper currency. Based on orders from the Board of Governors Federal Reserve System, we print for and deliver paper currency to that agency at a cost of slightly in excess of 1 cent per note for any denomination. So the Federal Reserve makes us print up the money, and they pay us 1 cent per any denomination, and then turns around and loans the money back to us at full face plus interest. So who's always going to win that game? Next, I have a series of $5 bills and the transitions that they've gone through over the years. Here's a 1928 $5 bill that says United States note at the top, and it's redeemable because it says we'll pay to the bearer on demand. Then you have, in 1934, a silver certificate, and it says this: this certifies that there is on deposit in the Treasury of the United States of America $5 in silver payable to the bearer on demand. Then you have a Federal Reserve note from 1950 that says this note is legal tender for all debts, public and private, and is redeemable in lawful money at the United States Treasury or at any Federal Reserve bank. See the different transitions? Now, these aren't all of them. This is just some of them. There's been many over the last couple hundred years. And then look at this: the United States note now from 1963. It's not backed by anything. It's worthless paper. And then, of course, today you have the Federal Reserve note, the new $5 bill, and it's, of course, not worth anything also. So in essence, it's all just monopoly money. I know this next scene is kind of funny. It's not intended to be, but that's the seriousness of the situation. Our money is worthless. All it's good for is this. You know what that is. That's what it's becoming worth very, very quickly. Now, there are those who argue that the national debt can be paid off in a matter of a few weeks if we just print up 24 hours a day money to pay it off. And then there's those who say that it can never be paid off because of the interest on the unprinted amount. Whatever the case, we are looking at over $16 trillion on the national debt, which is really fictitious and in the mind of the bankers. So that comes out to $53,253.38 for every American to pay off the national debt as of April 29th, 2013. So where does that leave us? It leaves us in very big trouble. The government has pledged all of our birth certificates as collateral on the national debt. In other words, all of our future labor has been promised to the Federal Reserve. When I went to go look and examine my personal state-issued or federal-issued birth certificate versus my hospital certification, I noticed that my hospital certification had more important information on it than the birth certificate did. But whenever I went to go use that hospital certification to get a driver's license or whatever, they would not accept it. And your birth certificate is just a copy. It's not the original. I think that they're hiding the original to keep information on there hidden. Now, on this birth certificate, it shows a number at the very top with the red arrow, 234322. And at the bottom, you see the arrow pointing. Unless you have very good eyesight or a magnifying glass, it says American Banknote Company. What does that mean? You're just a loan. That's the number that they use to borrow money on your name. And remember I told you that the capitalization of your name and the lowercase of your name has different legal meanings. I'm going to show you that in law. It's called a straw man. And I'm sorry that it's blurry again. I apologize. I did the best I could. But this is what it says. Strenuous homo, a man of straw, one of no substance, put forward as bail or surety. Blacks first. Then it says straw man person, a front, a third party who is put up in name only to take part in a transaction in name only. Nominal party to a transaction. Blacks 6. So if you don't believe me, go to your bank or mortgage company or DMV or Social Security office and try to change your name from uppercase to lowercase and see what they tell you. There's only one thing that can happen now, and that is change the currency, and they're going to do it. That's the only way that they can bring down the national debt, is change the currency. The money has already been printed from what I understand, and they're going to give you $1 for every 5 that you have as of the last plan that I heard of. Have you heard of the North American Union, the combination of Canada, the United States, and Mexico into one country and one money system? And it's called the Amerio currency. And here I will show you what it looks like. This is very, very serious information that I am showing you right now. There are 3 countries that have no Rothschild-controlled central bank. They are Iran, North Korea, and Cuba. Libya is no longer on the list. I want you all to understand the importance of what I'm trying to show you. This is some of the money of what it's supposedly going to look like. I can't prove to you or tell you that this is a fact, but this is what has been leaked out from what I understand. So, to all Americans and to the world, this is my plea to you, to take notice of what's going on. Do you want to know who owns the Federal Reserve Central Banks and who owns the ownership of the 12 central banks? It's been a very well kept secret, but the secret has been revealed. They are Rothschild Bank of London, Warburg Bank of Hamburg, Rothschild Bank of Berlin, Lehman Brothers of New York, Lazard Brothers of Paris, Kun-Lo Bank of New York, Israel Moses Saif Banks of Italy, Goldman Sachs of New York, Warburg Bank of Amsterdam, and Chase Manhattan Bank of New York. The individuals listed next own banks which in turn own shares in the Federal Reserve. The banks listed next have significant control over the New York Federal Reserve District, which controls the other 11 Federal Reserve districts. These banks also are partly foreign owned and control the New York Federal Reserve District Bank. They are First National Bank of New York, James Stillman, National City Bank, New York, Mary W. Harnan, National Bank of Commerce, New York, A.D. Juilliard, Hanover National Bank, New York, Jacob Schiff, Chase National Bank, New York, Thomas F. Ryan, Paul Warburg, William Rockefeller, Levi P. Morton, M.T. Payne, George F. Baker, Percy Payne, Mrs. G. F. St. George, J. W. Sterling, Catherine St. George, H. P. Davison, J. P. Morgan, Equitable Life, Mutual Life, and Edith Brever T. Baker. And for all of you out there who love President Barack Obama, I'm sorry, but I have to tell you the truth. He's just a figurehead or puppet, just as every previous president has been for at least the last 100 years of American history. Obama very well may mean well, and he's a good person, and that he really tried to help this country and thought he could make a change. But he realized that once he got into office that he wasn't at all the one in control or power. Just as all the rest of these politicians who sit on the Senate and Congress, They're just puppets. They've been bought out, and they do what they're told. And if they don't, they're not reelected, or they're disposed of. And the president, if he doesn't do what they tell him to do and follow their dictates, he's impeached or assassinated or whatever also. And I hope that I've been able to show you that throughout this documentary. Now, the other thing I find interesting is how Alan Greenspan and Ben Bernanke became the chairman of the Federal Reserve, because they're a private organization. They have nothing to do with the government. It's the president who nominates and appoints them to their office. And I find that interesting, being that they have more immediate power than he does. Shouldn't we have that power to decide who becomes head of the Federal Reserve or our money system? It's nothing more than economic terrorism. I feel that economic terrorism is the greatest form of terrorism ever perpetrated on man. So what is it? You never heard the word in the media before, have you? They talk about every other type of terrorism. When a man or woman has been blocked from a job because of their political beliefs or views or whatever, and they can't make money to feed their family and take care of themselves, that's economic terrorism. Or when a country's been overthrown with their money supply, or it's been taken over by a group of men like this, that's economic terrorism. And I find it very disturbing when I see artists like Jay-Z throwing up pyramids with his eye in the middle. And I start to question and wonder, well, what's going on here? And I saw him with Rihanna and Kanye West doing the same thing. Well, being that these guys are very influential in their industry of hip-hop and entertainment or music or whatever, and they can influence millions and millions of young people and people in general throughout the world, I started to realize that either they're doing it because they think it's cool, or they're doing it because they want to expose it, or they're doing it because they're a part of it. My hope is that they're just trying to expose it and make people aware of it, but my feeling is that they're a part of it. And Jay-Z mentioned in one of his songs that he wasn't a Mason, but there's an old saying, if it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, more than likely it is. So I don't know the truth of it. Maybe somebody can enlighten me on it. I am aware of the whole gay ballet black secret society and the whole gay initiation of Hollywood. And by no means am I bashing gay people or saying anything derogatory. I'm simply stating that there is a particular thing that goes on in the industry that is very questionable. And people like KRS-One has talked about this for years. And of course the most famous person being Tupac Shakur, who many feel was killed by the Illuminati for exposing it. And then Nas, and there's many others. I just wanted to point out a few of these very influential hip-hop artists who are trying to expose the New World Order. Another area that deeply troubles me is all of the senseless violence that's happening in our country. It's nothing more than uncivilized, barbaric, animalistic actions, and it must stop. There is no respect for life anymore. And the only way I can begin to understand and explain it is besides mental illness. And this is a big subject that I could talk about for hours. Because of the oppression of these people who are in control and causing economic chaos and different other things, I feel that people who commit these crimes do not understand what's happening. They feel the oppression, but have not learned how to process or figure out who or what is oppressing them. In other words, they are stuck in their reptilian brain. So they use destructive practices and violence against themselves and others. And it's very sad and just beyond comprehension for me. The whole point for me to make this movie was not because there were none out there. There are plenty and many, and good ones. It's because I wanted to serve notice to these people who control us that I know who and what you are. And I want them to know that many of us who you refer to as Goyim are awake and know what's going on. And just because we are not in your, quote, economic status or on your social levels does not make us all worthless people. And many of us will stand united against you. So you might be asking the same questions that I am. What is left for these people to take? They already control the money, the natural resources, food supply, religions, educations, etc. What else do they want to do to us? I think it's this. This group of men have a statement that they've made about us. And it says this: a nation or world of people who do not use their intelligence are no better than animals who do not have intelligence. Such people are beasts of burden and stakes upon the table by choice and consent. And you know what? We prove them right on most occasions. I am Kevin Perteete.